Let me start with Kirk Pengilly next to me, someone who had, in the report that's been released today by Chartered Accountants, there's a phrase called born global for startups, that they 80% or thereabouts are born global. You, in your period as a musician, didn't have necessarily the capacity to get online, go viral. You had to go face-to-face with your audience, didn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, our career was based on word of mouth. So starting out in the pubs in Australia, before a record company would sign you up, you had to have a following and sell out, have sold out nights in pubs in Sydney or Melbourne. So that was all done by word of mouth back in the late 70s and 80s, long time ago. But that's how it happened. And so people would come and see you, and you would put on the best show you possibly can, and they would walk away and talk about you and tell other people about it. And so a bit sort of like social media, really, but without technology.
And that was the same for going global in this sort of trade sense. You had to go back to the States, back to Europe time and time again.
Yes, absolutely. And what a lot of Australian acts did back then, and I don't know that most of them thought globally. Certainly INXS did think globally right from very early on. We thought, well, let's take on the world, not just Australia. And we left Australia before we'd had, number one hits here in Australia, and went to America, and we kind of one of the great decisions was that we took on the role of being a support band for big acts, so that we thought, well, a whole lot of people will see us and they'll talk about it, and then eventually maybe we'll be able to do our own big shows. What a lot of Australian bands did is got to a certain point in their career here where they were big, and then went overseas where no one had ever heard of them, and they play in a little club, to 30 people, and they went, well, this sucks, and they would come home and give up. But we kept pounding and going back, and the word of mouth thing again, that the olden day social media paid off.
Yeah, and now we see it happen, but via the
via the internet, yeah.
Via the internet. Kate Carnell, as a representative of small business, I'm interested in your view about this notion of going global, and it taps into something David Rumbens also found in the report in relation to trade facilitation online. You don't necessarily have to export directly as a business person. There are a lot of facilitators available today.
Look, that's absolutely true. And what we know from statistics in this space is that those small to medium businesses that are exporting, and there's now a lot of them, as in I think Victoria, the figures now show 22% of small businesses are exporting across Australia. The figure is pushing up to 20%, depending on the area. So that's a lot, taking into account that 97% of all businesses in Australia fall into the small business category. So we're talking about a lot of businesses. So how do they export is the issue. Now, the internet has been a great enabler, as have facilitators. And I suppose the issue really here is small businesses now are understanding that a market of 24 million people is great, but there's a really big market offshore, and that's the market they've got to be focused on if they want to grow and employ for the future. You simply can't rely any longer of your small market. The pubs in Sydney and Melbourne are fine, but you can't rely on them for the future. So it's really great that we're seeing more and more small businesses really get into that market. Our challenge, though, is to make it simpler for them. At the moment, it's not a simple game. Even with good trade facilitators, free trade agreements are great, but the Japanese one's 1,700 pages long. They're pretty opaque things from a small business perspective. So if we really want to grow this space, we've got to make it simpler.
And we heard that with David's comment when it comes to customs, and Mark Cully is Chief Economist at the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science. I know this is your view as well, that good regulation can actually facilitate growth, economic growth, but bad regulation hinders it.
Sure, what's the question? We all get that.
Yeah. So, but the question is, what is good regulation? What's bad regulation?
Look, I don't know enough about regulation as it applies to trade. Bad regulation on trade is tariffs, and we've done a pretty good job of getting rid of a fair bit of those. And then there's, I guess, the other form of bad regulation when it comes to trade is a whole host of various barriers, and we're not entirely guilt-free in Australia when it comes to doing that. I might just say, just to kind of throw a little bit of a spanner into the works here, that a lot of the discussion about trade is always about what can we do to boost exports. And when we're thinking about trade, we've got to think about the benefits to Australia of being able to buy imports and being able to bring those in ways that are less regulated and where there's lower cost imposed on the importers bringing them in.
But there's also the negative aspect, isn't there, David Rumbans, of that many politicians are grappling with right now, the impact on the labour market as well by these major shifts in where our major industries and growth is coming from.
There's quite an impact on the labour market, but is it so much from trade, or maybe it's actually normal structural change? I mean, we've been moving away from manufacturing as a source of employment.
But the point is the political reaction is anti-globalisation, isn't it? People see, they feel, whether it's right or wrong, but you saw it with Brexit, you saw it with Trump, it's anti-trade. That's the perception.
Yeah, and there's this strong association with of trade with those job losses, even though there's that structural change and technology story is a very significant part of that as well. So I think there is that perception there, but I think we need to work against that perception in a way, and that's not to say that people who have lost their jobs in manufacturing sectors and can see that goods are now coming in from other countries don't have genuine gripes. I think what that says is that in part our economic growth hasn't been inclusive enough for those people, and so while those gripes are genuine, we don't necessarily say, well, we're going to stop imports and send ourselves backwards 20 years in terms of what we can get from overseas. That's not necessarily a solution. It's more that, well, when as we do develop over time, we don't want to leave communities and regions.
Yeah, that's the key to it, isn't it, Kate Carnell, in terms of bringing the community with you?
Look, absolutely. There is no doubt that right across the Western world there has been manufacturing jobs have been lost. Initially to China and now to other low-cost countries. I must admit, even 5 years ago, if you could possibly believe that America would be building the wall and talking about putting up trade barriers, and China is leading, international meetings on the basis of free trade and being the bastion of free trade in the world, you'd say we've lost the plot. We've all got into the TARDIS and gone somewhere different. This is a really mixed up world we live in. Can I give you a good example of bad regulation? Tourism is really important to Australia and part of the trade deal. Last year, or year before last, we for the first time had more than 1 million tourists into Australia. In fact, I think about 1.2 or 1.3 million tourists from China. That's still only 2% of the Chinese offshore tourists. You know how long the visa application is for poor old Chinese tourists to get into Australia? 21 pages.
Is that that's still the case now?
My understanding is it's still the case, that it's a really long document, whereas many countries have worked out that you have to actually go online and it really shouldn't be 21 pages long. And you shouldn't, if we really want to maximise the benefit of our trade with China, both tourists coming in, our education space and so on, we've again got to make it simpler and we've got to compete better with places like the EU, the US and so on. It's a global market.
Yeah, well, we've seen disruption in a big way in your industry, Kirk, and I'm interested in your reflections on how the music industry's dealt with that, because obviously it did have an adverse impact in terms of music in this country as an industry.
Yeah, the music industry, stuck their head in the sand, basically, when technology came along. The demise of the music industry was illegal downloading, and that started happening in the 90s, where music was uploaded to, certain websites, but also just anyway, because, you could do that, and shared, and no one paid for it, and the music industry turned a blind eye to it, and eventually it sort of has come to now where it's a completely different setup. Mainly, we relied on record sales and CD sales and that sort of thing for revenue, and now you're seeing a lot of the acts of the world, or acts that were established over the last 3 or 4 decades, of touring again, because that's the only way they can make money. They're not getting the revenue from record sales. So it really took the wind out of the music industry. It took sort of the confidence and the funding to nurture artists and let them develop and produce their music the way they want to.
Are there examples of startups, musicians who get out there, become viral superstars?
There's plenty. I mean, Gautier, who went into America and won Grammys from someone from a little garage in Melbourne, basically. So, yeah, there is, and that's the thing, about technology. We're all talking about embracing technology, and the technology has always played a part in the music industry. I mean, right from obviously recording on tape and then going to the digital formats, and in all areas of the entertainment industry, technology has always played a huge part. Now when you want to, create some music or write a song, you do it on your laptop. Back in sort of the early days, the first big thing that came out was a Porta Studio, and it was a cassette, which Chris showed before with a pencil. It recorded onto a cassette, and you could record 3 or 4 different tracks onto it, and that was like a massive breakthrough for a songwriter, because you could record different parts and whatever. And the technology has just leaped and bounded with that, but also on the other side of it as well, as far as instruments and things like that that you can utilise to create sounds and create music. So that side of it's amazing. The hard part is the monetisation of music and the copyright and what the internet's sort of done in all areas of life is it's created this kind of pirate sort of culture where, I think the film industry and TV industry now are struggling with it too, because you can download stuff and watch it and not pay for it. And, so it's I don't know, there's areas of it that really the law needs to really catch up with it, the copyright law. But on the other side of the coin, I mean, it's an incredible opportunity to use those tools to create music and also to get it out there. Like I was saying before, the word of mouth thing. Now it's social media to get your thing out there and hopefully create a big audience.
Yeah, you came along at the right time when we all had to go and buy Shabu Shabar on tape or Kick on CD.
Well, yeah, that was, in my era, the compact disc came out, and that was like, oh my God, that's never going to take off, and and all of that. But you had to embrace it, and I think, INXS has always embraced technologies, and we were one of the first bands in Australia to record on digital medium and things like that. So we were never scared of it. But we are really in interesting times, and I think one of the current ironies, I think, is that we tried to protect Australia tried to protect importing from websites like Amazon and whatever, and put, I remember I used to be able to buy stuff on Amazon in Australia, and now you can't. Now Amazon's coming here. They've kind of gone, well, okay, we'll show you. We'll just come here, and they are going to game change absolutely everything we know in retail.
Yeah, indeed. Hard to argue with that. I want to ask David and Mark about the bigger picture now. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership has hit the fence with Trump. Should we be pursuing more bilateral agreements, or should we be jumping on board with the regional comprehensive economic partnership that the Chinese have been playing a big part in? First to you, David.
Look, I think both, actually. I mean, the practice has been that we've had more success on the bilateral front, and you know, it's easier if you're just negotiating with one party. And you know, I found it quite amazing that we were able to achieve those, you know, 3 free trade agreements, you know, Japan, Korea, China, all in quick succession after they'd been kind of stalled for many years, and all of a sudden the willingness was there, and they were all put through in quick succession. So, you know, that's probably where we're going to have more success. You know, the UK looks like they're going to want to be talking to us about that. So there's, you know, a willing partner there. But where are our opportunities coming from? It is the Asian region. So 60% of global economic growth can't be ignored. You know, we are, Australia and New Zealand, 2% of the global economy. You know, we want to open ourselves out to those other opportunities. So that's where the bigger payoffs are, but I think the success is probably going to, in the short term anyway, come in bilateral talks.
Yeah, well, that's the point, isn't it? If Trump's not pushing ahead with this notion of free trade, Mark Cully, that do we have to go around him to these other avenues?
Former President of the United States, Harry Truman, said he always wanted a one-handed economist because they'd always say on the one hand this and on the other hand that. My hand's with David on this side. I think he's right that we should be pursuing, you know, largely kind of bilateral trade agreements in Asia. That's where most of our trade already occurs, and there's huge opportunities for it to grow more if you believe in the story about the growth of the kind of Asian middle class, which I think most economists would sign up to.
Indeed. And Kate Carnell, the problem is, without being the doomsday individual in the middle, but if you look at the Asia as well, the North Asian move towards a more freer trade relationship between China, South Korea and Japan, for example, that's looking rocky too. It's not just about the United States and Europe. With this missile defence system in South Korea, the Chinese aren't happy. So even free trade in that North Asian region itself is looking problematic. So we live in an uncertain world, is the point.
Look, there's no doubt we do, but the benefits of RCEP, the Regional Economic Free Trade Agreement, is that now that the US have put the mocker on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I think there's every chance China will pick up on RCEP even more dramatically than they were. And remember, RCEP has India in it as well. So when you look at the growth economies in the world, RCEP looks pretty good from an Australian perspective. So I think that's a real positive. But look, you know, at the end of the day, and I think the report showed this, that trade upsides for Australian small businesses happen when people get off their arse and go and do it, really. At the end of the day, free trade agreements are facilitation of those things, but they're not the thing that makes them happen. The things that make them happen is businesses getting out there and doing it, finding good partners. There's some great examples of Australian businesses that have partnered with companies offshore or companies in Australia and doing smart things. There's a company called Burra in Victoria that's partnered with a Japanese company. They've built a new state-of-the-art facility to produce organic dried milk. They've doubled their size in a fairly short period of time. You know, there's Reed Fruit from Tasmania. They're a cherry company. They've partnered with a Chinese company and are now doubling their output. There's all sorts of great stories about companies that are just getting on and doing it. Free trade agreements facilitate that. They're important, but they don't make it happen.
What about national brands? Because the whole ethical consumer thing, or buying clean, I know it's big in China.
Yeah, it's really cool. That's why a chunk of these companies are doing really well, is because Australia is seen as clean green. It's as we saw that the whole approach of the baby milk thing for a while, where there's a whole industry in Chinese students standing outside pharmacies, my old profession, saying, "I bought it here today. Here's the newspaper," and sending it back. It shows that Australian products that are in Australia are trusted and therefore bought at a premium. So a chunk of those companies that I just spoke about, they sell to us into Australia, but, price is pushed down by our supermarket chains. They're getting premium price in China and other places because they're willing to have a go. And they're finding partners that can help them into the market in those countries, because that's challenging. You've got to protect your IP, just like in the music space, and you've got to get good advice on that. But I'll tell you what, the markets are there.
Yeah, they're huge, as you said before.
I mean, I think it also shows the increasing power of the consumer in some of these sourcing decisions. So people, are getting more interested in knowing where products are coming from. They don't want to, there can be a backlash. If you know that your products are coming from a sweatshop in Bangladesh where, people are underpaid and you had that whole incident of, the fire and tragic loss of life, and consumers actually got quite interested, or what products come from there. And so companies, can see that, and whether it's because it's the right thing to do or because they can see that there's a potential consumer backlash, are getting more involved in ethical sourcing, taking a much greater interest in it.
And what about the notion, we spoke about the decline in manufacturing. Is there a chance that with technology, 3D printing, for example, that our manufacturing capacity increases, because it can be, as Chris puts it, the kid in the hoodie that comes up with the idea?
Yeah. I mean, I think generally, if you think of technology, very generally has been a great facilitator for trade over the past few decades. It's opened up, a lot of opportunities. A lot of the intermediaries, the costs in the system have been broken down because of online platforms. But it could also work the other way. I mean, that example, there's all sorts of things. You think of, motor vehicle parts that we currently import from overseas. Well, and hold in warehouses for when they might be used. Well, if they can be quite efficiently 3D printed here, then that whole trade, dries up very suddenly.
Any thoughts?
Well, the game you want to get into is what some people call the smile curve, and you want to be up here on the smile curve. You don't want to be down the bottom doing the assembly. You want to be linked into global value chains where you're doing the R&D, you're doing the design, you're doing the customisation, you're doing the after-sales service. And the idea that trade is, we produce something here and we sell it over to China or New Zealand or the US isn't the way, but when you're talking about manufacturing, it's not the way it works anymore. If you think about a tennis ball, they reckon a tennis ball's travelled, in terms of the parts that go into it, 80,000 kilometres, parts sourced from 10 different countries, assembled in the Philippines, packaged up in Indonesia, and then it's making its way down to Melbourne or Wimbledon for the Australian Open or what have you. And that's the kind of the way that big manufacturing commodities are going, and that there are a bunch of Australian companies that are starting to make a presence felt in those kind of areas, but it's very niche. Medical devices, Australia's very good at that, and we should probably concentrate on what we're good at, and I think we should remember that the biggest selling thing in Australia, whether we're talking about what we sell here or what we sell overseas, is rocks. We do it in a very sophisticated and a lot of technology, a lot of collaboration with researchers that goes into producing iron ore and coal. And if you think about a company like Rio Tinto, the CEO of Rio Tinto says, we're not a mining company, we're a logistics company that uses world's leading edge technology to deliver iron ore at probably the cheapest cost it can be to China.
But we're selling animation too, a whole lot of really smart things in the art space. I mean, you see, Australian companies being nominated for Academy Awards and so on because they've done the back, the animation, a whole range of other bits of major films. We're doing some really smart things in that space in Australia, and we forget that. And we're exporting heavily in those areas. So it's not, yes, iron ore and agricultural products are fundamental and we do them really efficiently, but the future has got to be about our exports better representing what our economy looks like. And I think the report, talked about that. And our economy is increasingly about services. Yeah. It's about, smart technology like, animation, films, all sorts of things like that. So, we've got to focus on making our exports look more like our economy and not just about bits of our economy.
And Kirk, you wanted to make a point there?
I was just going to say, companies like Colorbond that actually take the iron ore and then they make steel and then they actually make a product with it. And just as a layman musician, it used to, annoy the shit out of me that we sent just iron ore off and didn't value add it and didn't make a product or even at least make steel in a form that could be shipped over and then utilised. And that's why I just wanted to point out that companies like Colorbond that have actually value added to the raw material, that's what we used to do. And I guess maybe it is a different world and it is a different sort of place, but I'm wondering if we missed something there a little bit along the way.
I think there's the point about innovation and design, and in that manufacturing space, I think we've found over time that, for better or worse, Australia hasn't been that efficient at production line manufacturing, and hence our automotive is closing down. But where we've shown excellence and where the higher value add is coming is in the design elements, the innovation. I mean, you look at the US and Silicon Valley, that they're not manufacturing all the iPhones and iPads there, but they're controlling, they're doing the design, they're doing all the software, and that's where the most of the value add in the iPad that you buy is in that IP.
But aren't we going to run out of cheap labour nations at some point?
And then the robots will come, Kirk.
That's true. Yeah.
No, seriously, that's true.
Yeah.
The interesting thing, though, is the growth of the middle class, isn't it? That globally, that there's still, it's going to go from 600 million to 3 billion over the next, 10, 20 years or whatever. So that there's a whole, growing group globally that's in the consumer space and are consuming high quality product, whether that's food or technology or whatever.
Or music, yeah.
Or music.
That thing that Chris Riddell had on in terms of the garage where businesses started, obviously it's the same with musicians, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
The images of the shed and you start there and you go, when was the time, the tipping point for you, when you look back at your career and you think, because I think it is relevant to businesses as well who are trying to get a foothold overseas, where you knew that you'd done the work and now it was exploding internationally?
Yeah, well, it took a long time. It took, 10 years. But, before I go there, just thinking of the whole garage thing and the shots of those garages, what happens now is that, an artist or a musician, starts in the garage and they stay there. Because now you can actually record your whole album in a garage where, before you had to go into an expensive studio and get a record company to fund it, and now you can do it on your laptop in your garage, so they don't actually leave their garage anymore. Yeah, it just gets, yeah. But as far as the point where it really turned, our career was very interesting because we had different record companies around the world. Most bands used to sign to one record company worldwide. So we had different record companies in the different regions. We were dealing with different markets for many years. And so it happened to us in a progressive, wherever we started working hard and then went to the next country, which we started in Australia and then went to the US and North America and spent a few years working really hard there and then went to Europe. So it sort of happened progressively, how much time we put in to a certain region was where the results started to pick up. And it wasn't until, as I said, about 10 years after we started with the album Kick that the whole world globally, it all kind of caught up and got in sync. So 10 years it took us, but of pounding on
But it worked.
every door we could.
It absolutely worked in the end, didn't it?
Yeah, it did, and I think In Excess was very unique in that we did our own thing. We basically, being Australian, we just didn't kind of listen to trends, didn't listen to what was going on, which maybe is against everything we're talking about here, but we weren't influenced by necessarily what was going on. We created a product that we loved and that we wanted to listen to and that we were happy in putting out to the world and performing night after night. Yeah. We weren't trying to be anything other than what we were and who we were and what we loved. Shall we say authentic? And I think that was maybe certainly to me, when I look at other acts that we were competing against at the time, I could see the lack of authenticity in them, and I could also see the, in some ways, the lack of talent in a lot of them. Yeah. But we put a lot of hard work into what we did, and we really focused all the time on trying to improve and trying to make ourselves better. And ever changing, ever reinventing. And I think that's a really valid thing, in this world today, in where we're at now, is, there was the pictures of the rainforest that Chris showed up. Nature is constantly changing, constantly evolving, just look what's happening in Queensland at the moment. And that's what life is too, and that's what business is like. It's constantly changing, evolving, the playing field's changing, and you have to constantly adapt and embrace it and go with it and keep reinventing. It's just a constant revolving thing.
And it's the same, as you say, it's the same in business, same in everything.
Yeah.
David, in terms of, we are a free trade country, we're dependent on it and foreign investment for a long, long time. Should we be re-examining things like the local content requirements in defence, procurement, infrastructure and so on?
Look, we're largely a free trade country. We have, we have restrictions and regulations on a range of things like, quarantine and so on, and there are, still some tariffs. So there's, And a lot of these things have a sensible basis to them. In terms of sourcing for infrastructure, it generally makes sense to get the most efficient provider. But look, that being said, there is also a facilitation role for government. We've talked about facilitation tonight. We can negotiate trade agreements, but there's a role for government to help to help business actually navigate that, and so in terms of purchasing decisions, and there is, and particularly in terms of the structural change that we're seeing, I think that's a relevant factor. But that said, we also need to get good value if we're talking about public dollars, taxpayers' dollars. We need to make sure that we get good value for that as well.
I want to, Kate, I'll come to you in a second, and Mark as well, get your reflections on that. But I should mention we'll have 5 minutes, or a bit more than 5 minutes of Q&A from the floor. So if you've got some questions, please get them ready, and I'll be going to you in just a moment after we hear from Kate and Mark on the point that David was just discussing.
I think that we do have an obligation to ensure that significant Australian expenditure, like the defence expenditure, delivers sustainability and to Australian industry as well. So it's absolutely true that best value for dollar is important, but so is ensuring that the dollars that we're going to spend on defence give innovative Australian SMEs a chance to grow their businesses and deliver to their sustainability to Australian industry more broadly. So it's got to be a balance. It's simply not about price. It's about getting best value, but it's also about ensuring Australian SMEs have a future and keep innovation here in Australia and help it to grow here in Australia.
And Mark?
So, We have a slightly different take on this answer to this question. So we had a lot about the phones in Chris's presentation. Most of the technology that's in here was developed by public funding in the United States, by the Defence Advanced Research Projects Agency. And that got a lot of that technology underway, and sure, it's been fantastically commoditised by companies like Apple. So I think there's a really important role, and it might be true when we're talking about things like the submarines, but particularly for the public sector in its role in funding science, CSIRO, which invented Wi-Fi, the various agricultural resource and development agencies, the cooperative research centres, and there's real spin-offs, if you can do that smartly, that helps Australian businesses commercialise those products and be able to sell them to the world.
We'll get some questions from the floor. Just if we could get the hand up. And while we get to our first question, I'll just make a quick point on the back of Mark's remarks there. In relation to my industry, we can broadcast now. We used to have a satellite truck. Now you can broadcast with a small backpack on your back with a thing not much bigger than this, and the technology, every item live view says made in Israel, because it was from the Israeli Defence Force of going into southern Lebanon and Gaza that came up with this capacity of broadcasting straight back the vision of their troops out and about. But every live view has made in Israel to this point. So it's that R&D that you're talking about. So let's get the microphone to, there were a couple of hands there. Question. Yep, first to you, sir. If you could introduce yourself as well and then fire away.
Hi, I'm Kerry Jacobs, UNSW Canberra. I'm wondering whether both in the policy and the debate we're actually missing the point, and as the conversation about exporting rocks overseas seems to be the major policy focus. The debate seems to be manufacturing, and yet the conversation clearly was about services, the transition to 3D printing. We're teaching overseas, education is one of the greatest export markets. We're talking about music and creative. So, are we already actually driving our policies and doing our debate about the old industries, so we're not actually focusing on where the emerging cutting edges are?
Kate, would you like to go first? And then
Look, as I said, I think our challenge is to get our export or our trade to look more like our economy. And of course, our economy looks like education and tourism and technology and a whole range of those things. That is the challenge. One of the of course, free trade agreements that's currently underway is probably one of the biggest free trade agreements that's being discussed, but is the services one. I think it's 23 countries involved in, what's it called, TISA, they've all got acronyms, looking at how there's a standard set for services trade across the globe. And I think that's really, really important. So what we do in the education space, fundamental, we've got to get the visa issue right. Sorry to make that comment, but one of the big impediments to really making education really work for us is some of the impediments we put in the way. Obviously, security matters, but I think maybe we have to focus on outcomes a bit more.
David? Sorry, Mark, and then to David. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to say I don't agree entirely with what Kate said on that. I think it would be a mistake to try to structure our export markets so that they mirrored the nature of the Australian economy. I think you export what you're really, really good at, and you import what you're not so good at, and that's how you win from trading. And that goes right back to 200 years, David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, which gets a reference in David's publication. So I don't, but it's not an either or. I don't think in terms of it would be silly to give up our huge comparative advantage that we have in resources. We're naturally endowed with as being the world's largest known reserves in about 10 different commodities. It's kind of staggering, and it would be silly to give that up. But there is huge opportunities in the service industries if we're smart about it. But we shouldn't be aiming to have exports to exactly marry the composition of what we do in our economy.
I think what I was meaning was about growth. I mean, fairly obviously, we've got to do what we do well, But in terms of where we're going to grow, it's going to be the things that we're doing well in our economy now, like education and tourism and technology, and I have to say some of the agricultural products that we haven't traditionally done, like high quality cherries, into high net worth households in China. This great story about a company out of Victoria who's looking at exporting fruit and vegetables directly into China, going into a big factory in Shenzhen, I think, where a robot will pick the order for high net worth individuals, ship it off. It goes into lockers at the bottom of major apartment buildings, and they just get sent a code to get it out of the locker, so they can get right from farmer through to high net worth individuals in China. Wouldn't that be cool?
Yeah.
From everyone's perspective, our farmers get paid better, but people get fresh fruit and vegetables almost straight out of Australia using technology.
Yeah, and there's the massive growth industry of marijuana.
Well, that's been a growth industry for a long time. Yes.
Growth.
I'm not sure I want to follow that line.
Sorry.
I love it.
So the report is the Future Inc. series. So it's about how the future is different from the current. So the things that we're good at now will remain good at. And thinking through, if you're focusing on export, the opportunities are maybe not so much about how our economy will look in 10 years' time, it's how our major trading partners will look. And we know that China the structure of its economy is changing much more rapidly than ours towards consumer goods and services. And, we've talked about the emerging middle class. At the moment, only 5% of people in China even hold a passport.
Amazing.
So, we're going to have a tidal wave of people who are going to be desiring consumer goods and experiences. So that's where the opportunities are. So if we want to capitalise on those, that's where we should be thinking about.
And education as well. It's not just having them here. I'm sure there are ways that we can export our services to those that huge middle class. It's amazing. Only 5% with passports. Sir, in the middle, your question. Have you got a microphone there?
Hi, my name is Edwin. I'm an accountant from Geoscience Australia. And reflecting on David's previous comment on how the global growth being not necessarily inclusive enough, and it's interesting that Mark just mentioned Ricardo, because that relates quite heavily to my question. Should the Australian government stick more with market fundamentalism, or should it actively impose regulations to help the potential losers of globalization and whatever other future trends there might be?
It's a good question. Who would like to kick off there? Mark?
Mark, you're from the government.
You would have to say that Australia has been a tremendous success story. And so it's easy on the one hand to talk about 26 years of without going into a technical recession, and to talk about average living standards. But your point kind of goes more to the distribution of how those gains have been made. If you were a person who maybe if Chris was from the US and his dad was there in the 1970s, and you were right in the middle of the income distribution in the United States, 40 years later, you haven't moved. There's been no gains in living standards. But in Australia, there's been strong increases in living standards all across the income distribution. And that's a function of having a decent minimum wage in this country. I know that's a cause of argument sometimes, but we do have a relatively high minimum wage, and it's increased every year, and it's distributed. The wage increase is distributed. And a pretty good system for redistributing taxes and transfers, so that we do smooth these things out better than other countries. So And we don't have an either or between market fundamentalism and regulation. We try to get a right balance. By and large, you'd say that we have been heading in the right direction. Hopefully, we'll continue to do so.
Any other thoughts?
I agree.
Any final questions? Yeah, one microphone there, thanks. And there was it's interesting how innovation and technology can find more about the world we live in. I don't know if you saw the news today, scientists in a rainforest in Argentina found this frog, a brown frog, under UV light. It's actually fluorescent green. I'm not sure they were smoking. Maybe it was just the technology.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. If you could, and introduce yourself when you ask the question, please.
My name's Alan. I'm from Synergy Consulting. I guess we talk a lot about innovation, and I'm just wondering from your viewpoint, whether innovation should be really driven by the government or by the private sector. Because at the moment, I'm hearing a lot of government policies that saying innovation is great, and all the ministers are bringing in ideas of innovation. And I guess I'm just wondering your viewpoint on whether, government should be driving innovation or just enabling innovation.
David? Yep.
I think historically, and Mark made the point earlier, we do good, we have good government-led R&D and good government-led science in Australia. We do that well. Compared to other countries, we don't do the business side as well. So either capitalising on the government or business research and development in its own right. So where might we put, it's not either or, but where might we focus going forward? Well, we seem to be, not as strong on the business side.
Okay.
I think fairly obviously the government has a role in R&D and encouraging innovation, and the rollout has got to be with the private sector. Government isn't very good at rolling out innovation. They're good at funding the research bit. So what we've got to do in Australia is we've got to get better at it. And it's right, we've been bad at commercialisation. I think we're getting better, but I think the challenge for government is getting out of the way. We have a nasty habit in Australia of over-regulating, of whenever there's a problem, we have another piece of legislation or regulation, and we get in the way of businesses being able to do what they need to do to take their businesses forward. There's the challenge for the future in this fast-moving world.
Kate Carnell, Mark Cully, David Rumbens and Kirk Pengilly, please put your hands together for our panel.